I want to talk a little bit about fake news and misinformation, which is something that's been talked about quite a bit for like 5 years by now. I'd say it started, I don't remember it in like the early 2010s, if you can remember back to the good old days before all the problems of the world emerged. I think it kind of came up like 5 years ago during the presidential election when the Democrats lost. They lost the Rust Belt, they lost union voters, they actually lost voters of color, as continued in 2020 as well. And so they were like, oh, we need to like look into like how did we lose to this game show host that was spouting a bunch of lies. And they're like, oh, we figured it out. It's these Eastern European trolls and some people from Russia that were spreading this story on, social media about Hillary Clinton running an underground pedophilia ring out of a pizzeria. He's like, this is why we lost the presidential election. That was fake news. We need to stop it. Then Trump kind of flipped it on them, and he's like, actually, what it is your fake news, CNN, and your fake news, New York Times, and your fake news, any news that ever does any news about bad things that I've done, all of it is fake. And so the word has lost its meaning. And now, but it's something that's still talked about a lot, and at this point, it's mostly liberals that bring it up in the context of, we have to fight fake news, we have to get rid of this misinformation. And as I sit here, which is probably going to be a few weeks before I publish the video, so it might be old fake news at this point, but just like yesterday or the day before, YouTube announced that they're going to like take down a bunch of channels and videos, actually ban channels that have vaccine misinformation. So like Robert Kennedy Jr. and a handful of other ones that have a bunch of misinformation about vaccines, like they're gone. And it's something that, and I think polls bear this out, and I'll try to find some and put them on the screen, but it's something that liberals have become more sympathetic to during the Trump years, which is censorship of fake news. We can't allow this fake news to spread. It spreads like wildfire throughout society and leads to demagogues and fascists like Trump getting elected because these people are believing all of this fake news, and so it's a real problem. So we need to take authoritarian actions, demand that these gigantic corporations, we need to make sure that they're censoring people. So that's the solution. I'm not going to go into that too much, but I think that's a bad idea, suffice it to say. But I actually want to talk about fake news and because it is a problem, but I think it's not a problem in the way that it's usually discussed. But actually, most of the things that most people have believed through up to today, but certainly if you take the long-term view and look at all of human history, most of it has been fake and untrue. People understand this because we don't believe what they used to believe. They used to believe a bunch of crazy things. And that's true with science, obviously. It's obviously more true with religion in terms of, I'd say almost everybody throughout human history has been some form of religious, and most of those religions are dead. We call them mythology. They're myths. People don't believe them anymore. But that people used to believe them, and even if, let's say that one of them was true, not all of them could be true. And they all had, maybe there's some deep underlying ubiquitous truth about spirituality and the nature of the cosmos that is kind of the thread that goes through all of them. But there's also like discrete individual claims that each of those religions were making about events in history, about how floods came about how the earth was created, about the predisposition and preferences of the various gods or goddesses, or how many gods there were, and why these famines came about, and how they should be worshipped. Let's not gender our gods. This is 2021. Worship the god, and they can't all be true. So just so most of what most people said about religion was fake news. This is my claim, and it's also the same with science. And so even if, I think we know more about science than we did a few hundred years ago, but I think it's also true that in a few hundred years we'll know more than we know right now. And I know that a few hundred years ago, I would think or a couple thousand years ago, that the earth was flat. And that would make sense because it looks pretty flat to me. And there's still people that believe that today. Another form of fake news, should we ban that belief, or should we maybe take another route into educating a society or developing a society that doesn't have those type of primitive beliefs, and instead they should evaluate the evidence? I'll get to that in a moment. But I would have thought the earth was flat, and then I got a little bit smarter. I'm like, the earth isn't flat, it's round, and the universe is circling us. And then maybe a little later I'd be like, it's not round, we're actually circling the sun, and the universe is a solar system. And then a little later they're like, wow, the universe is gigantic, it's a whole galaxy, this whole Milky Way galaxy, which they didn't know what galaxies were because they thought the universe was just the galaxy. And then they're like, wait a second, we're only one of, I think, like 2 trillion galaxies, or certainly hundreds of billions. I think there's 2 trillion galaxies roughly in the universe, and we're only one of them. So, oh my gosh, it's big. And now they're like, wait, it's actually, we might be only one of many universes in a potentially infinite multiverse, each one with trillions of galaxies. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And then they're like, not only that, but within these universes, I forget what it is, but like 90 or 95 or 99% of all the mass energy in it is like invisible and undetectable, and it's dark energy and it's dark matter, and we didn't even know about it until just a few decades ago. And so that's pretty interesting. So and let's say we figured it all out now. We're just a few years away from figuring it all out. At each of those points, the predominant view would have been fake news to the future view, and the only way that the more accurate view came about was by originally being a minority, a dissenting minority within that larger ocean of fake news or inaccurate information or less accurate information. And how did the more accurate information develop into the more dominant view within society? It's through discussion and evaluation and critical thinking by the individuals within that society that then, seeing the evidence, accepted it, and then it became the more ubiquitous view. And this is the way that information should be evaluated in kind of a rational society, is each claim independently judged based on kind of rational criteria of looking at it objectively and then coming to conclusions. And then if society does that, then a consensus emerges, and then maybe humanity slowly trudges closer to what is actual truth. But we still might have a long way to go, but this is the only way that you can go through it. But that doesn't mean that everybody's going to be on board, and there are certainly still people that believe the earth is flat today. We call them the flat earthers because we're super clever and we come up with fun names for these people. And there are people who think that including Sarah Palin potentially, I don't know if she ever said that, but that was the way that she was smeared by the disgusting liberals, is that she thinks that humans used to roam the earth with dinosaurs, or certainly other people do. And there's actually a museum somewhere in the Midwest, which I almost went to, which would have showed Noah's Ark, and I think there might have been people with dinosaurs there too. Because of course there were, because if you go back in the Bible, it's only 6,000 years old, and there's fossils of dinosaurs, and so of course humans were there, and he created us right away also. People believe that. Is that a view that we should ban? I mean, I won't comment on the religiosity of it, but should we ban belief that the earth is flat? There are people that think that there are reptilians, that humans some people are just lizard people. Should we ban that idea? Is that the way that we get rid of that idea? There are people that think that Elvis is still alive. Should we ban that? I mean, that doesn't have consequences like believing in, that vaccines are ineffective has consequences. It's also more irrational than that belief, because I think that a healthy debate around vaccines is good, but when all the evidence points in a certain direction, which it seems to me, and it seems to most of the scientific community, which is why consensus has emerged, it does, that vaccines are effective and have very little amount of side effects. When the population doesn't accept that, or some portion of it, just like a portion of the population doesn't accept what geologists say about the age of the earth and fossils, and or what geographers or whatever, the people that judge the curvation of the earth say about its roundness, its sphericalness, compared to the flat earthers who deny it, the consensus has emerged, the information is out there, and people are still rejecting it. Do we now start banning it like an authoritarian? I would argue no, and that's for a few reasons. The first is, I don't think authoritarianism is good, and I believe in the freedom of the individual to come to their own conclusions and not be strong-armed by the state. And I think that any objective evaluation of the lessons of history would say that, oh yeah, no, that's not usually a good trend to come down and start banning ideas and having the thought police, usually used as a pejorative, not as a way to describe what we should start doing in society. Are you listening to me, Democratic Party? And so I don't think that's good. Also, is it effective? I would argue probably not very. I mean, it is in individual cases of getting rid of Alex Jones from Facebook or Twitter, but there are downstream consequences, as I mentioned. But overall, is it making society more healthy? I don't think so. I think when you have to ban the idea that there are lizard people, the lizard people believers are now have a piece of evidence where they'll be like, oh gosh, look, even like the government, like they can't handle the truth. They're banning our ideas. And they don't go away. There are other corners of the internet and corners of America where these ideas fester. And even if the specific ones are able to be squashed out by the authoritarian boot of the state, overall, I don't think it's super helpful, because the mind, it's not a normal person that just, walks out of society healthy, having a rational understanding of the world, and then starts believing that the world is flat and there are reptilians everywhere and vaccines are ineffective, and go down the line. The people that believe those things have a predisposition to believe all of those things because a couple of reasons. One is because they probably don't have a very good understanding of critical thinking or the scientific method or evaluating information, so that's kind of condemnation of society. But also, even more so, and this is something that I have sympathy for, a lot of the institutions that are doing the banning, i.e. government officials, or a lot of like the liberal media has had op-eds and is, have people, coming on CNN saying we need to ban this. There's a bunch of fake news on CNN too. I mean, and I've talked about this in other videos, but the Iraq War is fake news. Even with the vaccine, even with the coronavirus, it was originally claimed by the scientific community masks are ineffective. If you go back to February 2020, and then that changed because the scientific consensus emerged. I don't say there's any malice there, but you could say the same thing obviously about the lab leak theory. It used to be, in fact, it was banned on Facebook, and now it's the consensus. And so they were banning what ended up being, it's not the consensus, but it's become more accepted. So they were banning something that has now become potentially viewed as accurate information by the scientific community itself. And that's what I mentioned before. There's always, it's true that in general, the scientific consensus is the best way to evaluate information. There's also true that there are different influences on different people within the scientific community, and that could take the form of where they get their funding from, or what people have individual biases, and certain people, there are biases even within that, but science at its best, I think is the best way to evaluate information. In general, I think it's accurate. But even so, each time that the scientific consensus shifts on a subject, it comes from a dissenting view within that same community. And if that view was originally squashed out, then that's not very good. So if people are really concerned about and they should be, really concerned about the ramifications of having tens of millions of people believe a bunch of kooky ideas and then, take action on those ideas, as is increasingly the case for the society. And it's not just on the right. There's liberals that believe some things that are absolutely not true as well. A bunch of liberals think that Trump won the election in 2016 because Putin hacked into the election systems. That's fake news, but it's not going to be censored. And also another small tangent, the only stuff that is ever censored is the fake news from marginalized outlets, because power can protect itself, and it also has an interest in squashing out competition from independent content creators and independent news outlets. And so what's going to end up happening is dissent is squashed, and sometimes truth is in that dissent, and that's what leads to society progressing scientifically or in its broader views. And so you're potentially squashing that out. You're also creating authoritarian structures and adopting an authoritarian mindset when freedom of speech is supposed to be like the bedrock liberal principle for a free society. And then also it's like it doesn't address the root cause. The real problem is that people believe these things because they've lost faith in institutions, and you're not doing anything to win it back because the government is run by a bunch of corrupt politicians getting their puppet strings pulled by corporations who have every interest in continuing the system as it is, even though that's making things very unstable and making people lose faith in it as their lives deteriorate, as they're taken advantage of, and fed a picture of the world which is largely untrue. And so that's not on the table to be addressed by those politicians calling for censorship and their allies in Silicon Valley and the like, who are making lots of money and at the peak of society. So instead what they do is they say, we're going to stamp out this fake news, which doesn't really have any, I mean, it might, as I said, in individual cases it might, but broadly, that is not the way to create a healthy society. And the idea that it is a big problem for the left. And so, and that's not just liberals, but Zoomers and young people are increasingly in favor of it because they view as like, this is how we stop hate speech, this is how we stop misinformation. The real way to stop hate speech and misinformation is to convince people not to be hateful and to create a society where people aren't predisposed to those types of hateful ideas or misinformation. That's not on the agenda for those institutions, corporations, and politicians calling for censorship. So I don't think we should be either. So something to consider. So a couple of points about fake news. The first, is that a bear behind me? Sorry, I'm just a little freaked out. There was a moose I woke up by a moose earlier, and I'm like, oh, that's a big old moose, could kill me. So now every tree I see in the background is a deadly animal.